Suspended under his parachute, CIA pilot Gary Powers watches as his U-2 spy plane smashes into Soviet countryside below. Confident in his ability to evade capture, he discards his maps and the silver dollar coin that contains his suicide device. He doesn't yet know it, but the events of the last 10 minutes will lead the Soviets and Americans to the brink of a nuclear war. Throughout the 1950s, American-Soviet tensions had steadily escalated. Each country openly possessed nuclear weapons and was actively spying on the other to determine exactly what firepower their opponent had. For the Americans, this initially meant launching so-called weather reconnaissance balloons along the Soviet border. These balloons would carry a long-range camera, but they were uncontrolled and they had a habit of crashing into Soviet territory, which revealed their true purpose. So the Americans turned their attention towards spy planes, and fortunately, they had the perfect aircraft for the job. To protect its identity, it was only ever referred to as the Article, and the pilots would only ever be known as drivers. We now know this aircraft was the Lockheed U-2. Able to fly up to 70,000 feet, the CIA was confident the U-2 could comfortably operate above all Soviet fighter aircraft and ground defense systems. But US President Dwight D. Eisenhower wasn't quite convinced. He was desperately worried about the political fallout should a U-2 be downed in Soviet territory. But with the threat from the Soviets ever increasing, Eisenhower eventually caved and permitted a limited number of U-2 flights over Soviet airspace. To reduce the risk of the aircraft being seen as a military attack, it would be operated by the CIA and not the US Air Force. The pilots would also be British and not American. This gave Eisenhower an element of deniability should anything go wrong with the missions. In fact, the Soviets did detect and track all of these U-2 flights, but their fighters were unable to gain enough altitude to successfully intercept the spy planes. The U-2s returned safely and provided first-class intelligence images. The Soviets issued the Americans with a letter of complaint, but the Americans denied the flights ever took place, and there wasn't much the Soviets could do to prove otherwise. An important backdrop to these flights is the rapidly approaching 1960 Paris summit. This was a meeting held in, Paris, which would see the French President Charles de Gaulle hosting American President Dwight D. Eisenhower, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and perhaps most importantly, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. For the first time in 5 years, a Soviet leader would meet the Western powers to discuss important matters such as reducing their nuclear weapons and the rapidly deteriorating situation between East and West Berlin. Eisenhower especially was excited about the meeting and didn't want anything to upset the talks. He was, however, being pressured by the CIA to permit further U-2 flights to investigate growing rumours around Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. Reassured by the CIA that the U-2 or its pilot would not survive a crash from 70,000 feet, Eisenhower eventually caved and gave the green light to another U-2 flight. He put a condition on the mission, though, that it must be flown by the 1st of May to ensure a few weeks of calm before the Paris summit on May 16th. Following the success of the earlier U-2 flights, this mission, codenamed Grand Slam, would be flown by an American pilot. These pilots had been recruited from the US Air Force, but to reduce any military implications should they be captured, had resigned their military commissions and were effectively civilians, although employed by the CIA. For Operation Grand Slam, the most experienced pilot in the U-2 program was selected, Francis Gary Powers. The flight plan would take Powers and his U-2 from Peshawar Air Base in friendly Pakistan into Soviet airspace, past the ballistic missile site at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and then the plutonium processing facility in Chelyabinsk before exiting Soviet airspace and landing in Norway. Several weather delays meant it was the May 1st deadline when Powers eventually took off on Operation Grand Slam. Since May 1st was a Soviet holiday, the planners believed there would be reduced manpower levels which would help the flight to go undetected. Unfortunately, this also meant there were reduced levels of commercial air traffic, and the U-2 was detected almost immediately. As with the previous U-2 missions, fighter aircraft were scrambled immediately, but were again unable to reach the U-2's altitude. As Powers passed the Chelyabinsk facility, though, something new happened. It turns out the Soviets did have a missile system that could reach the U-2's altitude. 3 surface-to-air SA-2 guideline missiles are launched at the U-2. The first of these missiles explodes just behind the spy plane. Although missing the aircraft itself, the force of the explosion rips the tail off the aircraft. Without the vertical stabilizer, the aircraft soon begins to enter a spin and fall out of the sky, and it's not long before centrifugal forces pull the wings off of the aircraft. Inside, Powers is struggling to get out. He manages to jettison the canopy and release his harness, but his oxygen hose is stuck, trapping him inside the aircraft. Before he can activate the self-destruct system, his oxygen hose snaps and he's sucked out of the aircraft. Days go by, and both sides stay silent, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Eventually, on May 4th, the US release a statement. They claim that NASA has lost a weather reconnaissance aircraft somewhere north of Turkey. They say the pilot reported issues with the oxygen system, and this may have caused him to pass out, explaining why the aircraft would have been off course. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev is surprisingly happy with the situation. Soviets have recovered a number of items from the crash site. In particular, they have the highly classified telescopic camera, photos recovered from the film, and a small switch that's labelled self-destruct. Khrushchev knows this is a CIA spy plane, but he decides to play with the Americans some more. And so begins a rather embarrassing political battle between the Soviets and the US. Khrushchev releases a counter-statement claiming the downed plane is not a NASA weather aircraft, but is in fact a CIA spy plane. Importantly, though, he gives no evidence for his accusation. With the Soviets not giving away any hard information, the CIA continue with their NASA weather plane cover story. They even go as far as to release a picture of a U-2 with NASA logos on. The CIA are still convinced that neither the U-2 or its pilot would survive a crash from 70,000 feet, and with no further information, they're confident that the NASA cover story will hold up. But now Khrushchev pulls the trigger on his smoking gun. On May the 7th, he makes an announcement saying, "When I made my first report, I deliberately did not say the pilot was alive and well. And now, just look how many silly things the Americans have said." He also releases pictures of the wreckage to show many of the U-2's highly classified systems have survived the crash. On hearing this news, a dismayed Eisenhower would famously mutter, "I want to resign." A week later, when the two leaders arrived in Paris for the summit meeting, it's fair to say the atmosphere was more than a little bit tense. Khrushchev felt that he had a good relationship with Eisenhower, but he was under pressure from Soviet hardliners who wanted him to break off the talks. He attempts to compromise by demanding Eisenhower apologise. Eisenhower responds by simply stating the flights are a necessity given the secretive nature of the Soviet state. Disappointed by Eisenhower's betrayal, after just 3 hours of talks, Khrushchev leaves the meeting. The breakdown in the talks saw American-Soviet relations fall to a new low. Both sides would continue their nuclear weapons programs, culminating in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and within 12 months, Khrushchev would order the erection of the Berlin Wall. As for the U-2's pilot, Gary Powers had been immediately captured by the Soviets. He was held in captivity, and although he'd been interrogated, for the most part he was treated well. In August 1960, he pleaded guilty to espionage and was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and 7 years of hard labour. In a dramatic conclusion to the U-2 incident, in February 1962, Powers would be traded in a Soviet-US prisoner exchange on the Bridge of Spies just outside Berlin. Interestingly, the CIA were initially against the exchange. Powers was also being exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel. Despite being convicted of espionage, Abel had never revealed any information to the Americans, and the CIA felt that he would be more valuable to them than Powers. The deciding factor was that the CIA had become aware that since Powers' capture, his wife had been seen with a number of men, and they were convinced that if Powers became aware of this, he might crack and divulge all the information he knew about the U-2. And so the prisoner exchange would go ahead. Returning to America, Powers would become a test pilot for Lockheed before becoming a helicopter pilot working for a news channel. In 1977, following a car chase in Los Angeles whilst working for a news company, his helicopter had run out of fuel. Trying to carry out a forced landing in a playing field, at the last minute, Powers saw some children. Attempting to avoid them, he lost control of the helicopter, and both Powers and his cameraman were killed. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel to find out more amazing secrets from history. If you liked the video, please give us a thumbs up and let us know what you thought of the U-2 incident down in the comments.